Thank you, Gloria, Yisheng, and Barry for this great initiative. It's great to see some unknown faces again, and discover new ones also. We're a small community working in this field of, let's say, digital philosophy somehow. So I'm very happy to present here some of the work we've been doing on what I call categorizing philosophy of science by means of topic modeling. But as you will quickly find out, our primary objective was not to do an ontology, but more to answer the question, what is philosophy of science about? What have philosophers of science been doing in the past century, typically? What have been the research themes that have interested philosophers of science? So our point of view was more the point of view of a historian of philosophy of science. And of course, to answer such a question about the content of philosophy of science over, let's say, several decades, of course, there have been expert analysis, doing this type of work. And of course, this type of expert analysis rely on expert knowledge. It may be biased to a certain extent. It's also extremely time consuming if you want to address a large corpus. So what we wanted to do was to use some text mining methods to approach a large corpora. One advantage that we also saw was that the text mining methods were bottom-up and data-driven, and we would be able to get some empirical grounding for claims that would otherwise be made possibly by experts. The interesting things that text mining tools make possible many different types of analysis. And here I won't talk about bibliometric analysis because this is not what we've been doing. We focused on the context, on the content of the texts, and therefore we were more interested in word frequencies, collocations, topic modeling, clustering, classification, or even network, and even other types of analysis depending on the metadata available, such as publication years, authors, genders, or location, and so forth. So we've done several studies. We started with a study just on the Journal of Philosophy of Science, just to find out what was in the journal over nearly 8 decades. We did another study on the Journal of Biology and Philosophy to challenge some, I would say, more naive views of topic mining, I would say. We enlarged our study over philosophy of science journals to include recently 8 journals over 8 decades, so the most significant journals in the field. And we also refined some of the works that we did on philosophy of science by working on what we call topic associative rules. And I'll be talking today about the 2 main studies here, the study that we did on the philosophy of science journal and the recipes of philosophy of science that make use of associative rules inferences. So here the data set is just the Journal Philosophy of Science from 1934 until 2015. And I'm presenting 2 studies, as I said. One study which is a topic model with synchronic and diachronic analysis, and another study which is based on rule inferences. So the corpus itself that I will show is, a bit less than 5,000 articles. It's not a very large corpus per se in the data mining world. It's a lot of words when you start thinking about the corpus in terms of full text, and a lot of sentences. So we included all regular articles as shown here in red, plus also the proceedings of the PSA that were published at several intervals since the 1970s. And in purple, you see an average word count per document. So that's the corpus. We did a topic model on that corpus. So the methodology is very straightforward. We did a corpus preprocessing. We did a part speech tagging and lemmatization and word filtering with a tree tagger and pen tree bank. We then did a vanilla LDA, with a Gibbs sampling to infer the topic models. Topic models are probability distributions over all words of the lexicon, and this is an output of the LDA. So the output gives you all the probability distributions over the words, and it gives you all the probability distributions of topics inside documents. So a document is represented by a probability distribution over topics. We interpreted the topics manually, as is usually done, by looking at the most likely words, the top 10 or 20 words, and retrieving text segments, as is used, as is done quite usually. And that led us to interpret 126 very relevant topics in terms of research themes that we then manually clustered into 16 categories. And in that particular study, we discarded 74 jargon topics that were not directly talking about research topics. And then we did a diachronic modeling by averaging the topic probabilities by 4-year time periods in that particular case here. So this is an example of a topic. You see this is topic 135. What you get from the topic model is typically for instance, the top 20 terms. You actually get the probability distributions for all these terms. So we see here, top terms include explanation, sample, explain, law, model, exponendum, and so forth. We can also retrieve the top 20 articles, or the articles in which that particular topic is the most probable. And we can infer that that topic typically talks about the deductive nomological model of explanation, hence the label that we chose for that particular topic. But of course, other labels can be chosen. And we also then grouped the topics together manually using our own judgment or expert knowledge of the field into categories, so as to make the handling of the topics more manageable in our study here. So the results that I can show here, these are some, they're a simple map of the different topics. I'm going to go into the topics themselves, but they've been colored here depending on the categories, and this is the representativeness of the different categories in terms of number of topics present in the corpus. So we have 6 topics about language, philosophy of language, 7 about logic, things that are more mathematical oriented, physics, models and simulations. There are topics about systems and complexity, chemistry, biology, mind, medicine, social sciences. There are some varia also, typically epistemology, scientific inquiry, theory, or metaphysics. But again, these categories were manual groupings that we did. The topic model itself gives topics, and the topics can be seen here. For instance, in this extracts here, in the category of physics, we have the topics quantum mechanics, relativity, thermodynamics, entropy, electromagnetism, celestial mechanics, thermodynamic, imperfect gases, and so forth and so forth. We have modeling, models and representation, computer simulation that we group together into the category models and simulation, and so forth. So I guess the objective here is not so much to go into the details of this topic model, but to show what in broad sketches what we've done. So here in biology, for instance, we see topics about evolutionary games, adaptation, life consciousness, emotions, teleology, natural selection, species, of course, function, evolution, and so forth. Same thing, for instance, about metaphysics, in which we have talked about space-time, realism, natural kinds, laws of nature, and all this. So all these topics are generated bottom-up, from the topic modeling, given certain assumptions about a number of topics. And the labels that we put are, manual interpretations of the content of these sets of words, based also on how these sets of words, patterns of words, appear in articles. This is the very rough overview of the diachronic modeling that we've done. And so it shows some trends of the topics over time, with some topics or here categories diminishing, for instance, philosophy of language, and others sort of fluctuating with the diverse fortunes. We can look at details of this evolution, for instance, looking at the top 20 topics per time period. So here it's plenty of colors, but we can see what happens to different topics at different points in time, in whether these topics were among the most likely or the most discussed at specific point in time. So here we definitely see the significance of philosophy of language, philosophy of logic from the 1930s up till the 1970s, then a sharp decline. We see mathematics related topics more or less continuously present at the same times. We see, for instance, here in philosophy of physics, it's about 10% of the top topics on average. Maybe we can spot two main periods in that particular case here. In the 1950s and 70s, there was more talk about relativity and quantum mechanics, and then 1990s, 2010s, talk more about quantum mechanics and particle physics. We also see some of the other topics that are most discussed in the philosophy of science in the journal here at different time periods. And in the year 2000s, we see the appearance of more discussions on models and simulations, for instance. So these types of diachronic graphs can be studied and analyzed at that level. But we can also zoom in on specific topics and follow their diachronic patterns. So, for instance, here, focusing on scientific explanation, I've just shown you the topic DN explanation about the deductive nomological model of explanation. We also found two other topics in our model, one that we called explanation accounts, and another one which is more on mechanistic explanation. And we can look at how these topics fluctuate over time. So we see the DN deductive nomological explanation topic sort of go up here in the 1950s, 60s, and then go down, and then the other explanation, other kinds of explanation somehow go up in discussion, and then the mechanistic account of explanation going up, especially in the after the year 2000s. So that's one possible way of looking at topics, single topics or groups of topics that may shed light on the history of, let's say, research themes in the philosophy of science. And of course, we can track top articles at different periods of time if we're interested to dig into this particular topics. Now, concerning the other study that we did on the same corpus, here we took a three-stage approach. We first so the data is the same, and we're talking about the journal Philosophy of Science, but our approach was we wanted to understand how different topics were used together in articles. Right, so we were interested about the associative patterns that topics form inside given sets of articles. So we use a three-stage approach. The first stage was to do a clustering of our articles. Very simply, we used the k-means to do the clustering, and with different heuristics such as TSNE representation and trial and errors, we settled on a number here of clusters of 17 that appeared to be the best fit for that particular set of data, and then we implemented a rule search algorithm to infer an extremely large set of associative rules. These rules are if-then rules with as antecedents conjunction of topics, and as consequent any one of the 17 article clusters. So rule predicts the cluster on the basis of a certain number of topics being jointly present inside an article. And to do the rule search, we used the a priori algorithm. And then we used a filtering approach based on the micro-average F measure to just retain the most, the set of rules that was the best compromise, because we didn't want to retain all rules here. So the results are a number here of 96 associative rules. So first, the 17 clusters. So here are each dot represents an article. So it's a TSNE representation of the different articles. Each color represent a cluster, and the names that we've given to the clusters were given on the basis of the average proportion of topics in that particular cluster. So that's the rules are going to predict whether an article belongs to a cluster or not. And so here are the rules over the cluster. And as you can see, the rules cover different different parts of the map. There are more rules in some areas than in others. So if we look at one particular example here, again focusing on the explanation, we see a little set of rules that go from topics. Topics are triangles. Triangles are joined together into a dot, right? And the dot is the rule, and the dot then points to the square. The square is the cluster. So we see in that particular example here a few sets of rules. There are actually 3 rules that use a number of topics, and these topics are associated together in particular ways in articles of the cluster 16. Right. So when we look at the details, we can when we look at the topology of the rules in a way, we can see a small microstructure here, and we can investigate the rules themselves when they point to given clusters. We can also look at the what we call the mesostructure. We see that in some cases topics are used in rules predicting that predicting to one cluster as well as predicting to another cluster, and so we see small clusters of rules somehow being interconnected here. So here we have a number of rules that concern the cluster natural selection, another one concerning species and natural kinds, and we see that they're somehow interrelated. Also, there are topics here, evolution, that are mobilized in rules concerning the cluster about genetics and reductionism. And another one here, neuroscience, topic neuroscience, is mobilized in rules about genetics and reductionisms, but also in rules about models and so forth. And looking at the rules also, so not only make possible the prediction of whether an article belongs to one cluster or another, but makes it possible also to understand the extent to which topics are shared between clusters. And we can then build an understanding of the macrostructure of the complete corpus. And here we see typically 3 different regions, orange or pinkish region that is interconnected, more densely connected with associative rules. Then the other ones, then the greenish is separate, and then the bluish region includes clusters that seem to be much more specific, right? So prediction of an article belonging to these clusters seems to be easier because it relies on a few rules mobilizing a few topics. And with that, I'll thank Jean-François Chartier, Francis Larraud, Davide Pulizzotto, who worked on these different studies, and JSTOR also, who made available the corpus. And you have the reference here of the 2 main studies. And with that, I'll welcome questions.